She has gone to ground in Carradine's own country. The gossip ran through London, and serve her right, jilted at the altar before the whole of society. Who could blame the man for crying off? The Duke of Carradine heard it 3 times before noon, in 3 different drawing rooms, and by the 3rd he had ordered his horse, and was riding north before the sneering tongue had finished its sentence. He had been there, in the church, when it happened. He would carry the sight of it to his grave. Sibella Hart standing alone before the altar in her wedding silk, the congregation murmuring like wind in dry grass, and the empty place at her side where a faithless man should have stood. A note had come instead of a bridegroom, handed up the aisle by a mortified footman, read in full view of 400 eyes. The Duke had watched her read it. He had watched her go white and then perfectly, terribly composed, watched her lift her chin and turn and walk the whole long length of that church alone, past the staring faces, with a dignity that had broken his heart clean in 2. No one had moved to help her. He had half risen, and then she was gone, out into the grey morning and away, and within the week the whole town knew she had fled to the country to bury her shame where no one could see it. Octavian had loved her quietly for 2 years. He had never spoken. She had been promised to another man, and he was not the sort to press a suit upon an engaged woman. He had told himself the feeling would pass. It had not passed. And now the man who had won her had thrown her away before the eyes of the world, and the Duke of Carradine found that he could no more stay in London and let her grieve alone than he could stop his own heart from beating. So he rode north, into his own country, where her family kept a small cottage on the edge of his lands, and he did not stop to consider how it would look or what he would say. It was past 4 when he came up the lane, and the autumn light lay long in gold across the country garden, where late roses bloomed against a low stone wall, and a tangle of lavender ran wild along the path, and there she was. She was kneeling among the flowers in a plain grey country gown, her bright wedding finery put off, her hands in the cold earth, for the work of it, he understood at once, the simple labour that gives grief somewhere to go. She had not heard the horse. He drew rein and sat for a moment, unwilling to break the quiet of her, this proud woman the world had humiliated, finding what peace she could among the roses. Then his horse blew and she turned. She came up off her knees in a single startled motion, one earth-stained hand flying to her breast, and stared at him as though he were an apparition. "Your Grace." Her voice was raw with disuse and something else. "Carradine, what are you doing here?" He dismounted. He had rehearsed nothing on the long ride. Every speech had seemed false, so he said only the truth. "I was there," he said, "in the church. I saw what they did to you. I have not been able to think of anything else since." He took a step toward her along the garden path. "I came to see that you were not alone. That is all. If you wish me gone, I shall go and trouble you no further. But I could not stay in London making polite conversation while you were here, and so I am here." For a long moment she did not speak. The wind moved the lavender. Then her composure, the iron composure that had carried her down that terrible aisle, simply cracked, and her eyes filled. "They are saying it was my fault," she said, very low, "that I was found wanting, that he saw something in me at the last and was right to flee it. 400 people watched, Your Grace, and not one of them came to me, and now they are saying I drove him to it." A tear fell. "I came here so that I should not have to see their faces. I did not expect, I never expected anyone to follow." "They are fools," said the Duke, and there was a low fierceness in it that startled them both, every one of them, and most especially the man who left you standing there. "He has done the single most foolish thing I have ever witnessed a man do, and I have spent 2 years calling myself a greater fool for never daring to do the wisest." He stopped a pace from her. "I will not press you. You have been pressed and abandoned and shamed enough for any 10 lifetimes. But I will not have you believe, for 1 hour more, that you were found wanting. You were not left because you were too little, Sibella. You were left because that man was too small to know what he held." She was weeping in earnest now, silently, the tears running clean tracks down her dust-smudged face, and she did not turn away from him, which he understood to be a kind of trust. "Why?" she managed. "Why should you ride 2 days into the country for a jilted woman you scarcely know?" "'Cause I have never scarcely known you," he said. "I have loved you the better part of 2 years, and held my tongue because you belonged to another man, and watched from the edges of every room you ever entered, and told myself it would pass. It has not passed. And when I saw you walk that aisle alone with your head high, while the whole of society turned its back, I knew that I would ride to the ends of England before I would let you grieve a single day longer believing yourself unloved. That is why." The Duke had said more in those 2 minutes than he had said of his heart in 30 years, and he stood now, in the gold light of the country garden, mortified at his own boldness, certain he had presumed too far upon a wound too fresh. But Sibella was looking at him as though the ground had shifted under her, as though, after the cruelest betrayal of her life, the world had quietly handed her back something she had stopped believing in. 2 years, she whispered. You never said a word. You were promised. It was not mine to say. And now? Now, said the Duke, and his voice was not quite steady, you are promised to no one, and the field is empty, and I find I am no longer young enough or proud enough to ride away and call it honor. I will give you all the time in the world, Sibella. I will court you slowly and gently, and ask nothing you are not ready to give. And if your answer is no, I shall be your friend and your neighbor, and never speak of it again. But I will not pretend I came here as anything but a man who loves you. She stood among the roses with her earth-stained hands, the late sun gilding the wreck of her grief into something almost luminous, and for a long moment the only sound was the wind in the lavender. Then, slowly, she crossed the path to him, and she looked up into his face, and she said, They told me I should be ashamed to show myself for a year. They told me no man worth having would want a woman so publicly thrown away. Her voice steadied as she spoke, the proud spirit coming back into it. And here is the Duke of Carradine, 2 days' ride from his own house, standing in my mother's garden telling me he has loved me for 2 years. A tremulous, wondering smile broke through the tears. I begin to think, Your Grace, that I was the most fortunate jilted bride in all of England. He took her muddy hands in both of his without the smallest hesitation, and raised them to his lips, earth and all. He did not rush her for all that. He took a cottage in the village, and he courted her through that long gold autumn with a patience that undid her more thoroughly than haste ever could. Walks along the boundary wall, books left at the cottage door, hours in the country garden where he learned the names of all her roses, and she learned, slowly, to laugh again. There were setbacks, for grief does not heal in a straight line. There were days she could not bear to see him, when the shame rose up again like a tide, and she sent word that she was unwell. And on those days he did not press her, but left a small posy of late roses at the door with no card, so that she should know she was not forgotten and not pursued. There was a morning she wept in the garden and told him she did not know how to trust a man's promise ever again, that the last one had been made before God and 400 witnesses and had brought her nothing but ruin, and the Duke did not argue with her. He only said quietly that he would make no promise she could not see kept with her own eyes, that he would simply be there, day after day, until the steadiness of it told her what words never could, and he was. He came in the rain and he came in the frost. He mended her mother's garden gate with his own hands. He sat with her in long silences that asked nothing of her, and the long, slow proof of his constancy did, in the end, what no grand speech could have done. The man who had jilted her, hearing in town that the great Duke of Carradine was paying open court to the woman he had shamed, found himself the object of the very mockery he had hoped to escape, cut by the same society that had whispered against her, while she, far from hiding her year away in disgrace, was claimed before all the world by the most honourable man in 3 counties. They were married in the small grey village church the following spring, with the roses just coming back to the garden wall. There was no congregation of 400 staring faces. There were the village folk who had come to love her, and the Duke's own people who would have followed him anywhere. He slid the ring onto her finger, and beside it the Carradine signet, which he pressed into her keeping with a quiet word, and she stood at the altar this time not alone, but beside a man who had ridden 2 days to be certain she would never be alone again. At the wedding breakfast, in the gold light of the cottage garden where it had all begun, the Duke drew her aside from the company for a moment, to the low stone wall and the lavender. "I have been thinking," he said, "of that morning, of you walking that long aisle by yourself with your chin up, while 400 cowards held their tongues. I used to think it the worst thing I ever witnessed. And now I think it the most fortunate," he said, looking down at her in the spring sunlight. "For if he had not been fool enough to leave you standing there, I should never have been brave enough to come and stand beside you. You walked out of that church believing you had lost everything, Sibella. I have spent every day since meaning to prove to you that you had only lost what was never worthy of you, and found, 2 days north, the man who had loved you all along." And Sibella Hart, who had once walked alone down the cruelest aisle in England, looked at her husband in the warm spring light and knew herself, for all the world's whispering, the most cherished woman in it.